I'm Rob Dansman, and this is the Better Semester, where I provide insight and actionable advice to parents of college students. I'm a nationally certified counselor and licensed clinical mental health counselor, specializing in work with college students and their parents to improve mental health, organization, and motivation. Stef, thank you so much for joining me this morning. I'm really looking forward to hearing more about what you do, your business, all the details around it, as well as some of the kind of personal path items that we were talking about just a second ago. So if you're all good, let's start questions.
I'm so delighted to be here, Rob.
Excellent. So let's jump right in. What do you do? Where do you work? Name of the business, everything like that. And maybe give some details about the specifics of what you do, as comfortable as you are with that.
Sure. So I'm an independent educational consultant, which basically means I work with high school students starting 8th grade through 12th grade to help them develop and execute successful college admission strategies. So it includes everything from high school course planning, summer activities, extracurriculars. We do all kinds of assessments. And then, of course, as we're getting into developing college lists and executing those applications.
Excellent. And do you work, you said independent ed consultant. Do you work on your own? Do you have your own business? What does that look like?
Yeah, so I have my own business. It's called the Mauler Institute. So it's myself. I've got a team of amazing writing coaches. I've got an assessment specialist, and of course, our director of student success, who just makes sure all the trains are running on time. But independent in that I don't work in partnership with any particular college or school. I'm not an enrollment manager. I'm not an agent. We are working just with families.
Okay. And so just to let everyone know, we will put any websites, any links, any books, any references you make, we'll put in the show notes at the bottom here. So do you have any financial ties to any higher ed institutions, or is it completely separate? I
Completely
mean, is
separate.
it okay?
Completely
Um,
independent. We work for families on behalf of families to help families navigate this process to help those families achieve their goals.
okay. How how did you decide to start the kind of the grade zone, 8th through 12th? Why not 7th graders or 6th graders or only ninth graders or 10th graders? Like, how did you decide that age range?
Well, first of all, I think 6th and 7th graders need to be 6th and 7th graders. And I just got a call from a 7th grade parent, and I said, call me next year. So the reason I start with 8th graders, and I'm not working with my 8th graders as intensely as I'm working with my juniors and seniors, but in many schools, 8th graders are starting to take high school classes, and it's in 8th grade where they need to select their ninth grade classes. And so, with all of my 8th graders, we have a 4-year high school plan, which we revisit every year. But I want to make sure that those students have the high school classes that are necessary to be admitted to any school in the country, because some of those decisions in 8th grade can have lasting repercussions. Furthermore, it's the summer after 8th grade where colleges start looking at resume items. So summer planning becomes a really big deal. And if you think about it, for most students in the US, summer is roughly 3 months long, give or take. So a student who leverages all 4 high school summers has a full year of development, growth, learning versus a student who just kind of sits and stares at the wall.
Yeah, it sounds like you were thinking about it from a developmental perspective. First of all, your comment about like let 6th and 7th graders be 6th and 7th graders. Maybe it's too young to get them stressed out about thinking about college. Um, and it also sounds like developmentally, that summer after 8th grade is, I think that's what you're referencing. That's a good time for the process to begin, because these higher ed institutions are, that's where the clock starts ticking in terms of accumulating data that influences their decision making. Um, are are there ever students that you see that, do you, if a parent comes to you and says, we want our kid, because presumably it's not the ninth grader that's contacting you, it's the parents. Um, Are there parents that ever bring a kid to you who you think maybe college is not the best path for them? And if so, how do you how do you frame that response to parents? Because they're the ones paying you, and they're the ones saying like, we want our son to go through your process, and we want everyone to go to the Ivies or a fantastic state school or something like that. What does that conversation sound like?
So, first of all, let me be clear. I don't think everybody has to go to college. There are many paths to success. College is but one of them. It just happens to be the one that I work in. So when I meet with families, first of all, I won't meet with a family unless the student is there. So I require the student to be in that first meeting because it's the student who needs to choose the process and the student needs to choose the partner. And there are times where, and in every single meeting, I ask the student, do you want to go to college? And sometimes they say, I don't know. And I think that's a really worthwhile conversation to have. Typically speaking, the families who work with me are not the ones necessarily where the student should not go to college, but maybe is not ready to go to college just yet. And so I am a big believer in gap year programs, as long as they are productive gap years. So again, sitting and staring at the wall or playing video games for a year is not productive, but going, learning a language, getting a job, trying an internship, you know, doing some exploration, very productive.
Steph, I have to disagree with you. There are lots and lots of kids who think that playing video games is a very productive use of their time.
Well, to be fair, my husband was in the video game business, so I'm very pro
Oh
video
man,
game.
okay. I can't tell you how many times I've heard students like say, Rob, there's research on the hand-eye coordination of playing video games. And I'm like, yeah, dude, I know, but like let's look at how many doors does that open? Yeah.
It's a
So
big industry.
it is a big industry. We
Video
we'll
game
tread
industry's
we'll
been very good to me, so.
we'll tread lightly. We'll tread lightly through talking about gaming. Um, so you talked about a gap year program and how you're a fan of gap year programs and not all students. I like what you said about not all students should start immediately. Where what tingles your spidey sense when you get a student because you're not acting as a clinician, you're not acting as their
Nope.
therapist or psychiatrist or psychologist. What do you see from your perspective where you're like, oh, this kiddo maybe not ready to start fall semester after senior year of high school? Yeah, what are you seeing when that comes up?
Well, if we just remove the obvious, health issues, that kind of thing that needs to be addressed, I'll have students who come to me, say, fall of senior year, and they just haven't done the work that's necessary to get to the kinds of colleges that they would like to target. They don't have basic things like standardized test scores, or perhaps they made a misstep in some classes and maybe need a little bit extra time to redo some things. Um, some are coming to me saying, hey, I'm really thinking about community college, which is a really great path for some students. And I think, well, why community college? Why not take a year, grab a job? Let's rethink this application. So some students just need a little bit extra time. And I don't know why in the US in particular, we're all in such a rush. I don't know what the end goal is that we're all speeding toward. In Europe, gap years are very common. So I don't know
I
why we haven't normalized it here.
I know that friends and colleagues of mine that are in Australia, it's a cultural norm after high school to take a year to the point where many parents will kick their kids out of the house and say, you need to go travel for 6 months or a year before we're going to put any money towards higher ed. So yeah, it seems like the U.S. is one of those outliers. I wonder. Maybe this is too much of a rabbit hole to go down. I wonder if it's because higher ed has a vested interest in not enthusiastically supporting gap years. um,
Yeah, but I wonder if we might have more successful outcomes for freshmen going to college if they had an extra year of growth and maturity and experience and really understanding why it is they're there.
right. I agree. Yeah, the recidivism return rate, spring semester of freshman year seems to be dropping, especially among young men
Mhm.
over the last few years, even before COVID. Uh, Obviously, I'm biased. I'm clinician. I wonder if you see any quasi or suspected clinical issues that are popping up with your high school students that you're working with, where it may not be academics, as you said, it may not be about a class that they need to retake or they didn't do certain testing. I wonder if there are some mental health, behavioral health, even medical issues that you see kind of popping up on the radar that might be better addressed rather than kind of going into freshman year.
I mean, and I am not a therapist, I'm not a clinician. Um, However, and this is not news to anybody. I mean, anxiety is off the charts. And I think that there are a lot of things that are feeding into that. Um, this is a generation that's grown up on devices. Everything is recorded in perpetuity. They're marketing themselves all the time. Nobody can have a bad day or a zit. And on top of all of that, and I'm seeing this actually bleed into the academics and the quality of the applications as well, because we've got devices all the time, nobody has the time to be bored. And because that, people now, I think the level of critical thinking skills is really on the decline because people just don't have time to sit and think.
I like that a lot. I like the B word a whole lot because humans for, well, hundreds of thousands of years, it was the default setting was to be bored, and we started sharpening sticks and stones, and it got us
That's where
to
creativity is,
right.
right? That's where it evolves when you've got nothing else to do.
Also, brain development. Uh, Not just in terms of creativity, but also abstract thinking skills and making connections, thinking abstractly about relationships and um, where do I want to go to college? If we're kind of bored on a walk, we imagine our future. But if we're always being stimulated, we may not have access to thinking abstractly about our future. So I like it that you brought that up. How do you, again, I'm going to go back to how do you frame these conversations with parents? Because I can't imagine that it's always like super lovely, comfortable conversations that you're having. Sometimes there may be some uncomfortable truths with the parents or the student.
So this is a really big topic, and it's a conversation I have among my colleagues across the country. Um, it's a really big challenge, and I think there have been so many things that are leading into this anxiety. And quite frankly, I'm really concerned about a number of students in my client base this year because they have these expectations of getting into these fancy X schools. And they have expectations for decent reason. First of all, since COVID, grade inflation has been rampant. Everyone's got an A average. Everybody. That's why schools are going back to standardized testing.
That's a good point. That's a really
So
good point.
everyone's got an A. Their parents see all these straight A's. So of course Stanford is in play for them. And it's Stanford and Harvard and Yale and Brown and Penn and Cornell. And never mind that nobody who would be really happy at Penn would also be really happy at Brown. So they're not even looking at what these school experiences are. They're not looking at what the educational philosophies are. They're not looking at what the opportunities are. I mean, totally different educational philosophies at these schools. But they're applying to all of these fancy schools. And I try to have these conversations with parents and with students. I try it first from just straight data, right? Okay, you're looking at a 3% acceptance rate. Well, let's take 12% off the top for recruited athletes, and let's take another 13% off the top for international kids. And the numbers it's just a math problem, right? Far too many great kids, not enough spots in these schools. Well, when the data doesn't work, then I try to approach it from sort of the emotional, intellectual anxiety perspective, which is, hey, little Katie is working so hard and has worked so hard throughout high school and really wants you to be proud. And I would really hate for Katie to get the unintended message that unless she gets into crazy school X, she's somehow a failure or a disappointment. And I have to tell you, Rob, like this year, these arguments are not landing. And I am about to have a number of students who have swung way above, you know, I think that we're going to have a lot of disappointment. And furthermore, these are students who have always been used to achieving, and it's going to hit really hard. I'm really concerned about the mental health impact of having these outsized expectations in the college admissions process.
I think that's such a good point. I see it. I see the I see a few clicks down the path for these students where they're hitting sophomore year and it's just not working. And often they are in a business school somewhere. They are in over their heads. And when after the rapport has been built, after they have felt comfortable enough to share what do they really want to be doing, not their passion. I can't stand the P word.
Thank you.
No passion. No. What we need to be focused on is ability, interest, and compensation. That's the sweet spot, I think. And so when I start having that conversation, 75% of the time, and it's especially young men now, they are saying, "Ah, I don't want to be here." Like, and not just in my office, or a Zoom meeting, but they don't want to be in that B school. They don't want to be in those classes. They want to be doing something else that's not not poetry or English class or anthropology, but like they want to be doing something else that's productive, but not living out this expectation from their parents. But the expectation feels different than it did 10 years ago. It just has a different flavor to it from my angle of things. And one of the things that I communicate to my clients, almost all suffering, unless it's traumatic brain injury or trauma from childhood, is we can see a proportional relationship between suffering and the gap between reality and expectations. The problem is whose reality and whose expectations, and often that's where the biggest misalignment is. And then on top of it, there's no communication in families. There's no communication. There's little communication between parents. There's little communication between parents and student. I mean, and we can go kind of like all around the system. So, and it sounds like you are seeing that on the onboarding side because you're in very early in the conversation around like what are we going to be doing for the next 4 years. So and I like that you pointed out they're not curious about the school experience because Brown is very different than Penn. um, very different
Both great
cities.
schools, but very different.
Right. Yeah. Um, Interesting. So what are you doing differently? What are you doing differently in terms because you're owner. You get to decide um, how you work with parents and students. Are you doing anything differently, or is it really just kind of updating skills in terms of how you communicate, but you're letting parents kind of drive the ship towards like what they want?
Well, I mean, keep in mind, parents are paying me. So there is that. I do have in my contract, though, so I work with students on up to 12 applications, and I have in my contract that I get to pick two.
Oh, that's interesting. I like that.
And sometimes, on occasion, it's a kid who maybe isn't pushing themselves far enough. But more often, it's the kids who, I want to make sure that every kid has great options. And, in this process, which is so, anxiety producing, I often encourage parents to have at least one school that is a mental health play school. So I typically start working with students January of junior year on applications for an October, November submission. So that's 9, 10 months. And so we work feverishly for these 9, 10 months and we submit, and then they have to sit and wait. And waiting is excruciating. And depending on where they apply to school, just because of the way the deadlines work, they might in some cases have to wait until March, April. depending on the schools. And so there is something to be said for submitting an application to a school where they're either an auto admit or that has a rolling application, which means they review applications and make decisions in the order in which they are received, to a school, even if it's not their top choice, but a good choice. So that, because waiting with an offer in hand makes for a much happier household than waiting when you're, have no idea of what's happening or what's going to come in until March of senior year.
This interview is not going to go well because I keep thinking of more and more and more questions for you. Ah, man. Okay, I'm going to try try to get through these. Do you see a trend in the degrees that people, meaning parents, um, are kind of over indexing towards?
Yes.
Because years ago, I would say maybe 7 to 10 years ago, and then earlier, degrees were not really all that much of a focus. It was more like the school was the focus, and then choosing a major or a degree once you get in there. Are you seeing something change in that? Are you seeing a change in the programs, if not specific degrees, but like a program like a business school? We're going to aim for that, and then we're going to decide, is it finance or real estate or whatever the kind of like specific degree track is. And then I'm going to pile on a whole bunch here. Do you see a difference in gender? Like how people are applying? Do you see more women, men, young men, or transgender? And do you see people more comfortable or feeling compelled to um, kind of articulate gender as a focal point? And then the last part of this is, how have the personal essays changed over time? So that was a really easy question. You'll probably be able to spit out an answer really
So
fast.
yeah, so part of this might just be a little bit myopic just because of the client base I serve. So I would say most of my client base are families either very, very highly educated from very, very fancy schools in the US who are now kind of trying to help their kids get in. And of course, the landscape has changed. Or families who are educated outside the US who are very educated, but their children are now first generation US, quite frankly, as I am. And so I think that a lot of those clients come to me. I grew up in Canada, so I grew up British system and came to the US for school. So I very much understand the differences and the difference in expectations between British system schools and American schools. I think because of that, yes. So a lot of computer science. A lot of my families come from South Asia. So that's kind of been their ticket to come to the US with visas, and they've done well. And so that is why computer science now is the most competitive major in the country. In my client base, just because of my background, I have a business background. I tend to work with a lot of business kids, pre-med kids, engineers, computer scientists. In my client base, don't work with a lot of artists, performing or visual. It's a whole different area of expertise, so I tend to refer those out. So my perspective might be a little bit skewed. Nationally, of course, yeah, women are going to college in much higher numbers than men and are staying and graduating in much higher numbers. And if you haven't, I'm sure you're probably familiar with Dr. Leonard Sachs and his work. Brilliant guy, and studies the growing gender gap between men and women. I'm now forgetting the rest of your questions.
Uh, well, piggybacking on the gender question in terms of like the percentages, but also I injected in there the transgender part that is, I think it's come up over just the last few years. And it seems like a very messy topic for so many different reasons. And I wonder if you're seeing anything with that, or is that just not really a factor?
It is, but in smaller, I would say more in my client base, and this might just be a question of sort of location geography. I mean, certainly more than 10 years ago, but not in large numbers. I would say, interestingly, during COVID, I had a lot of students come out as gay, and particularly women.
I had the same experience.
Yeah, it's
Same
interesting.
experience.
Any thoughts as to why?
Uh, I'm going to sound like I'm 80 years old now. I think that I think there was a social media aspect to it. I don't think that it was the only factor. I think it was a dominant factor. Uh, and the reason why is because there were there were several variables that were consistent among all of the clients that I worked with. And this is going to sound very specific. And it's actually leveled off since then. I would have clients that either needed a higher level of care, with their parents contacting me looking for residential treatment or an IOP or PHP. Uh, Sometimes they were trying to find like medication management. There was a trend where uh, the individual, the client, would change their name and they would change their hair color. They would change the length of their hair. And this sounds very specific. I had dozens and dozens and dozens of clients from all over the country within the span of 3 or 4 years. Before that, not it, I mean, maybe once a year, maybe every 2 years, I would have something like that. There was something that was happening, and it started during COVID. And I can see it very distinctly. Like, if I were to go back through all of my intake forms, there was this very distinct line, and it's trailed off since then. And in terms of like other factors, there was an opportunity to explore. I think because if I'm imagining experimenting with my identity, or if I truly believe that I am something different, it's much safer for me to do that, presumably, in my home rather than out
Cool.
and in school.
Mhm.
And so I think there were just so many kind of factors, but I think that those were kind of some of the dominant ones. Um, the last part of my question was about the personal statement and some of the essays that need to be written. And I'm not even going to bother asking about ChatGPT and all that because we already know, like, don't do that. And even though people are still doing that and whatever, um, what's changed in terms of personal statements?
So, and this is probably practice specific. So, when we work with our students and personal statements, we try to push our students to get to what we call second order insight. So, first order insight is like high school level thinking. It's the thinking that anybody in that situation would have. So, it's my soccer team is going to the state final and we haven't won and we're down 2 points and the star kicker sprained his ankle and is off on the sidelines, and you know with a minute left we managed to win. So first order insight is persistence, teamwork. It's very boring.
Right.
So we always push our kids to get to second order insight, which is what is the insight that only you had in that moment. Like, maybe it was something about how the star kicker led while wasn't on the team. Or maybe there's some insight about, wow, sometimes a good leader actually has to take himself out of the situation so that other leaders can emerge. Or maybe it's like, what is the thinking that's only you, so that you can show admissions that you have a different level of thinking and you can push your future classmates to think. So that's what we always strive for. It has been harder to get there. The lack of critical thinking has been very difficult. I thought that it would change once we got rid of the COVID kids. So this is the first year that students, did high school in school, and we're not seeing it. I thought it was going to turn around this year, and it hasn't. And I think it gets back to that. Everyone's getting A's. I think teachers are tired and they're not pushing kids as much in school, and it's the lack of boredom. Um, so I think
there
that's a
there
challenge.
there's no necessity to examine deeper.
Yeah.
There's no reward for examining deeper. There's no reward on TikTok for um, explaining the why behind the what.
It's not even that. It's even just the amount of attention students are putting to just basically reading feedback because we live in a headline world. So they're not even reading the article. Like they're just not even getting the amount of feedback. So it is extending the number of drafts we're doing with our students. I'm not sure that there's much difference in terms of topic selection, but there is difference in how we are working with students. We're finding we have to take more time to teach them how do you structure an essay, how do you put together an outline, how do you plan what you want to say. Like these are things that should be taught in school and they're not. I mean, our students typically for a personal statement they're doing 20 drafts.
It, I'm going to make a statement and then ask a question. It sounds like really what you all do, the roles that you satisfy or need to really embrace are that of consultant, English teacher, quasi therapist. Because that question, that second order question, whether you like to hear it or not, that sounds like a therapist question. I mean, that is fantastic. That is how you get to something real. You know, that authenticity. Like, don't give me this BS about like, like, oh, we need to overcome, this really hard thing. Like, no, duh. you know,
Right.
um, yeah. What was I love that part. Like, oh, what was the insight only you could have in that moment, which really pushes someone to dig deeper. The question, and I'm gonna lead this away from the topic of kind of the content of what you do, and then more towards like the personal side of like how you got here. What differentiates you? And you can make this as sales pitchy as you want. What differentiates you? Because you're not the only one doing this. There are plenty of other individuals, groups that are doing ed consulting and coaching that know how to edit and they know how to ask like thoughtful questions. Um, what differentiates you from everyone else?
So my background is squarely rooted in business, right? I have an MBA, that's my background, and I approach this from a business perspective. I am a certified educational planner. So I have all of those credentials. A lot of my colleagues are former teachers or counselors who are no longer in the school system for one reason or another. That is not me. And so what differentiates me is I use proven business principles and strategies to help students identify what differentiates them from everybody else. What's the unique value proposition that they offer to schools? And we use that application to communicate it.
I don't know if you do this already. It sounds like it could be scaffolding infrastructure or a template for what students use junior year when they're applying for internships and when they're about to get into career. I mean, it sounds virtually the same.
It's so funny you say that. So I have a student. So my juniors in spring of junior year, I believe the most important part of this entire college admissions process is to identify what makes each and every student unique. What's the impact they want to have? In business, we call it an elevator pitch, right? I will have students in spring of junior year. I mean, they'll spend a month working on 3 sentences. And it's really funny what you just said, because I was speaking at a panel actually at Harvard Business School about college admissions. And one of my former clients, who's now at UChicago, was there and he was sitting in the audience and he came barreling up afterward and was like, Steph, I just used my elevator pitch to get the best internship. So it's the same elevator pitch he used in high school to get into college. He's now using to get internships and jobs. So it's exactly what you're saying.
Students are so poorly prepared from high school to college and so poorly prepared to uh, for internships and resume building and interviews, um, and then starting a career. I mean, it's just absolutely amazing to me. And these are students that are in business schools.
Well, and it's so ironic too, because their whole life on social media is curated. So you would think that they would be better positioned to market themselves than we were. You know, we were kind of fumbling our way through. So so it's a little bit ironic that they spend their lives curating their TikTok, their Insta, and everything else, and yet when it comes to presenting themselves in person, it's an interesting.
That's a good, yeah, I think that's a really great insight. Yeah, that is the the contradiction, because they're so poorly prepared. Um, yeah, I also I take schools to task because they're not, in my humble opinion, especially business schools, not preparing students. Like it's almost like they're, um, the information they're working from is from like the late 90s or early 2000s in terms of like resumes and CVs and interviews, and it's just not updated, um, for what students need. Steph, you made mention, I'm going to switch gears. You made mention to being in the corporate world for a little bit. I wonder if we could really go in the way back machine and talk about like, um, how did you get here? And let's start with like undergrad, if you're cool with that. How did you choose? Did you have someone working with you? You mentioned that you came up through the British system in Canada. Uh, yeah. So what was your path, and how did you land here?
It's a very long and windy path. I'll actually go a little bit farther back. So my mom was a World War II refugee from Ukraine. And so ended up in Canada, which is where I was born and raised. And as is the case for every immigrant refugee family, it doesn't matter what your country of origin is, the story is the same, and that is education is supremely important, as it was in my family. And so I was interested in some of the highly selective schools in the US. The Canadian system is, as I mentioned, more similar to the British system, which means you really have to track what you want to do from high school because you are applying to a specific faculty. And if you want to switch faculties, you basically need to start over from the beginning. There is no liberal arts sort of philosophy, no general requirements. So you really need to understand what you want to do quickly. I went to a pretty small boarding school, 84 students in my class. So I didn't have access to all kinds of different things. So I was interested in some of the selective schools in the US. I did my undergrad at Penn. And it was so interesting to me coming from a system that was so quantitatively based. I couldn't understand why there were so many kids who were class valedictorians, perfect test scores, not being admitted to their top choice schools. And then there were kids like me. I mean, I was smart. I was not my valedictorian. I couldn't even take my SATs in Canada to meet the deadline. So I had to drive 13 hours to Princeton, New Jersey while I had a cold, armed with only a book because it was pre-internet. And I took my SATs at Princeton High School during their homecoming parade. And they were not good, but I was admitted. And so, to be perfectly honest, I started volunteering in Penn admissions when I was a freshman in college. I started out as a tour guide, walking backwards, avoiding potholes, and eventually grew my role. And I worked there for a lot of years and I loved it. But it was also really frustrating because for every kid who was admitted, there were easily 7 or 8 more who would have been at least as selective. We just didn't have the space. And so I looked for patterns. What were the patterns that distinguished the kids who got in from the kids who didn't? Found a pattern, used it on myself when I applied to graduate school. Again, without a 4.0 GPA or an 800 GMAT, or the ability to donate a building, which helps and is legal. Bribing crew coaches, not legal. Donating buildings, legal. Couldn't do that though. But I was admitted to every MBA program to which I applied. So I did my MBA at Harvard, and then post business school, followed a more traditional MBA path and ran a few divisions of a consulting firm in Washington, D.C. in the supply chain manufacturing space. But off the side of my desk, because I was like working with super smart, interesting young adults, I was kind of the unofficial graduate school counsel for all of my colleagues who were doing their obligatory 3-4 years of work experience. And so everyone who used my system ended up in top programs in the US, handful in the UK. We moved from DC to Texas for my husband's business, he was with GameStop, so video games. I got tired of flying back and forth to DC every week. And so I went back to school to UC San Diego, which is one of a handful of schools that offers a graduate program in college counseling. And so that's kind of how I got here.
And it makes sense when you look back on it.
But I mean, there were, after undergrad, I did go to Wall Street. I worked at, hated it. Went back to work for an undergraduate professor and actually ended up teaching part of the exec ed program at Wharton before applying to Wharton. So that was a good letter to have in my application. So it's been a long and windy road, but I find that most people, probably in my age group, do have a long and windy road.
Thank you. Uh, why start your own business though? Because I mean, you could have worked other places. You could have, I mean, you could have worked in academia. You could, I mean, that long and windy road could have led you towards provost or chancellor. I mean,
Yep. And I was
realistically,
actually looking in that direction. And I met, through various connections, I met with a woman, an amazing woman, who was previously the dean of admissions at U Chicago Law School, who now is an independent educational consultant. And within 10 minutes, she spoke to me and she said, "You are absolutely do not have the demeanor or the patience to work in higher ed."
that sounds like a
I said, "You're
compliment.
absolutely right."
That sounds like a compliment. Um, so let's put aside the consulting portion of getting into college. What advice or insights do you have for current college students based off of your path? It could be as informal or personal. Yeah, what are people not seeing that you wish they could see?
That's a great question. So I think that there are a few things. So one is, in my generation, it was predicted that the average person would have between 3 and 5 completely distinct careers, not jobs, careers. It's certainly true for me. So I started out in finance, I went to consulting, and now I'm in education. For my child, who is now a junior going through this process, high school junior, it is predicted that their generation will have between 5 and 7 completely separate careers. So building those, foundational skills, the critical thinking skills, the inductive, deductive reasoning skills, the ability to spot opportunities and capture them, will be vastly more important even than in our generation, which is why I'm still a big believer in a really solid liberal arts foundation. So I think in my client base, and I think there are a lot of students who have a lot of anxiety about knowing exactly what they're going to do for the rest of their lives. Um, and I would just tell them to kind of like take a breath and look at various opportunities and, raise your hand and take the opportunity. And also, when you are in the workforce, is to be the person who volunteers. If there's a project nobody wants to do, be the person who volunteers. If
So having
if
a
you
bias
lead with
towards
yes, if
yes.
you just say yes, you will become the person who not only gains more experience, gains more relationships, but is the person who your superiors will say, give it to that guy, because that guy is always up for doing the extra work. I think that's
Yeah.
how you distinguish yourself now, because so few people do it.
Uh, what concerns do you have? And you might have a little bit of like insider knowledge because of what your husband does, but also it sounds like you also have colleagues in a lot of different industries and sectors. How is AI going to eat? I mean, everyone's doing computer science. I think about it from the angle of computer science, finance, even consulting, anything that's data focused seems like eventually is going to be eaten up by AI. What are your thoughts on this in terms of like the insights for like what skills to acquire? Because in 1890, if my parents had said like you should totally go into a buggy whip manufacturing, you know, um, industry, I'm like, oh yeah, that sounds great. Well, within a few years, like there were cars everywhere and the buggy whip industry was gone. So I wonder, like, yeah, how is AI going to change what recommendations you give to students?
I can't even wrap my head around AI. I keep trying to. I just, ah. Well, I mean, first, I think every student needs some level of digital literacy, regardless of what you do. But I think it's going to change industries in ways that we can't even acknowledge. I'm not sure, though, yet how many companies have figured out how to make it profitable. It will come. Um, there are so many different schools of thought on this, and I've talked to different admissions directors about this. There are certainly, I think it's going to come to AI as a tool, much like a calculator is a tool or a computer is a tool, and we need to figure out how to leverage it. So I think actually your critical thinking skills become more important, not less important.
Sounds like taking classes in philosophy. Uh,
Well, I'll
and
tell you, I have a good friend of mine who is probably one of the, if not the world's expert on stadium financing. And one of her most recent hires for her team, history major. And I said, why? Because speaking personally, because my son is a junior and wants to study history and is terrified he'll never get a job. And I'm like, no, just go study history. You'll be fine. So I asked her, why history? And she said, I've got models and spreadsheets. I can teach math. Math is easy. But give me somebody who can read vast amounts of information, distill it down, spot trends. That's the person I want. I'm like, okay.
that's a really, I've never, I've never thought about history majors in that way before. I think that's a really good point. It that strikes me as why when sometimes clients will ask about like going into behavioral health or healthcare, and they ask about, oh, can I get a master's degree to do blah blah blah? I'll say like, no, that's really not a great idea unless you want a terminal degree for ending here. An undergrad degree is more valuable than a master's degree because of the classes in research and reading research and being able to understand what's going on with it. Even if you don't conduct research, being able to understand it is one of those skills that is just really hard to teach. But once you have it, it differentiates you from a lot of other people. What are the biggest obstacles? I'm going to switch gears again. What are the biggest obstacles right now for you doing your job? And let's say like your company, um, the folks that work with and for you, your own stuff. Like, what are the biggest obstacles?
Well, one that we've already touched on is just truly expectation setting and helping families really understand what the landscape looks like and how it might have been, how it's very, very different from when they went to school. Um, so just the level of competition in these various schools. And it's not to say that their kid isn't great, they're all great. But I think expectation setting and also an understanding that you're going to get a great education at a lot of schools. It doesn't have to be the same 20. So I think that's really, really important in terms of just business operations. And I'm sure you face this in your business as well. It's just, it's how do I serve more kids? There's only, one of me. And unlike a lot of my colleagues, even though I have a team with me who are amazing, I still work with every one of my students individually from 8th grade to graduating high school. And so it's how is it that I can offer more, better, and help more, better? Is like every year this time we're kind of finishing up college applications hopefully in the next few weeks, and my team and I will do a postmortem as we do every year to say, okay, what can we do better, how can we offer more value, can we take on more students, because I hate telling a family, no, I'm so sorry, I don't have capacity to help you.
I I live that every day. Um, what do you wish you talked about what what you wish parents understood to some extent. What do you wish colleagues, mental health providers, schools, high schools, private schools, what do you wish all of the colleagues out there and professionals and providers, what do you wish they were doing differently or what do you wish they understood?
In terms of college, there seems to be a great, and I will actually separate out mental health professionals because I think they do understand this. Um, but schools, parents, the rest of us, there is so much emphasis that is being placed on how do we get you to the right school, and not a lot of emphasis on what will it take to be successful and get through that great school. And so I have a lot of families who come to me and say, okay, what do we need to do in eighth grade or ninth grade to get our daughter into school X, versus the approach I take with my son is, let's really look at who your kid is and celebrate who your kid is, and then find the environments where they're going to be most successful. I mean, it astonishes me that when we start talking about college lists, it astonishes me how many people just go to these, rankings, which we can discuss why they're invalid, but nobody spends any time thinking about, how does my child learn? What is the right classroom environment? And so, like, we do a version of Myers-Briggs with our juniors so that we can understand, are you going to excel in a large lecture hall, in a small discussion-based class? Are you somebody who can sit and talk philosophy and theories for 4 years, or will that drive you cuckoo? Do you need a project-based or a co-op program? So people are leading with brand perceived prestige, which I actually think might be changing. And they're not actually thinking about, okay, what does my child need and where are they going to be most successful?
So it sounds like what you're talking about is shifting from an outcome orientation to a process orientation.
Yes. And again, you will get great outcomes at so many of these schools. And presumably and arguably, you'll get better outcomes if you're at the top of your class in a less ranked, lower ranked school than if you are, struggling to keep up, at a fancy school with a 3% acceptance rate.
It's better to be in the top 10% at a lower tiered school rather than the bottom 10% of an Ivy.
Agreed.
If you could rebuild higher ed, I'm going there. I'm going there.
Not trying to save the world or anything here, Rob.
Unlimited resources. Uh, you can't change politics or let's say like uh, the pull of gravity and some other like natural forces. Um, but you had unlimited resources in terms of time, money, energy. What would you do? And I like this question, even though it's a painful question for people, because it's not just about what you do for work and a living and how you connect with parents. It also communicates a little bit about your values too, because there are lots of people that I talk with who they still want or they still agree with society kind of being broken down into these tiers, which is not good or bad. It's just like, oh yeah, like we still need to be pushing students into the highest education formats possible. Let's forget about whether or not like there are enough jobs waiting for them afterwards. Other people, they want to break the system down and say like, we need more plumbers. We need more electricians. And so if you imagine recreating higher ed, what does that look like?
You couldn't have given me this question to think on like in advance or in our session. Well, oh gosh, we could have a whole other, 3-hour conversation about this. So if we're going to reimagine the system that we have, one is I would want to completely do away with all things rankings, marketing, which also then means we get rid of like rock climbing walls and beach pools. And not to say that we can't have fun, but there is this fever to get kids wanting to apply to your school so that your acceptance rates go down and your rankings go, up. And I think if we do away with all of that, then we also start to do away with these uncontrollable costs, tuition costs. So that's a beast that needs to be tamed. Because I
Sounds
mean,
like you're
you're
talking.
looking at some school, like you're looking up, we're approaching $500,000 at schools like U Chicago, which is insane. So I think you need to tame that beast. And then with that, that means we've got resources to make education more accessible, more affordable to those who want to go down that path. We also need to celebrate the trades. I mean, I had a kid come to me a few years ago and I said, "Oh, what are you interested in doing?" "Well, I want to go to business school, but only if I can go to one of the top 3 business schools." And I said, "Okay." And I said, "And what if not?" "Well, then I want to go to med school, but only if I can go to one of the top 3 med schools." And I said, "Well, explain." Like, and I'm looking at this kid's activity. I was like, "You haven't done science fair. You've got nothing. Like, tell me why." And he said, "Well, I just want to make a lot of money." And I said, "Well, that's fair. That's a fair goal." I said, "But let me tell you, from my perspective, I come from Canada National Healthcare. It's not a fast ride to making millions of dollars. And when 2008 hit, I went to arguably one of the best business schools on the planet. And when 2008 hit, more than half my class was unemployed. And I said, "So you want to make the surefire?" And I said this, no joke. I said, "Surefire bet to make money, become a plumber. I can never get my plumber. He charges, $250 an hour, and he's got a wait list months long." So I think that we need to celebrate the plumbers, the chefs, the trades, absolutely. And I think in this environment, we need to instill what I think used to be higher ed, and somehow we've gotten away from it. And that is to require every student to have a minimum of classes that are Socratic method discussion based with various viewpoints. Not just to expose yourself to different viewpoints, but to be able to craft your ability to articulate and think through different issues, regardless of the topic.
Yeah, those classes don't exist anymore. Although ironically, there's a movement in many states for state level institutions. There's state legislature going on, being enacted, where they're trying to force universities to have more viewpoints respected. But there is some evidence that it's actually to silence certain faculty members.
Interesting.
And so it's being framed as like students are not able to have their First Amendment rights like supported, but it might be something different going on. And so it seems like there is a like a hat nod to that, but in practicality, it's actually not going in that direction. You've mentioned several times or a few times about the rankings. Can you talk about that for a second? Because you said like, oh yeah, the rankings of these universities. What do you know about the rankings? And some of the popular ones are um, Princeton Review, I think
U.S. News and
has.
World Report.
Yeah. Can you talk about like where do these rankings come from? They're not, you mean to tell me they're not objective? Like,
So
um,
the rankings started to like sell magazines. That's it started. U.S. News and World Report started. So it wasn't at like a data house, a think tank. And so And there's a lot of fallacies in the rankings. You can game the rankings. And I think the rankings is to blame, quite frankly, for a lot of the problems that we have in admissions now. So lots of numbers go into the rankings. I also don't see how you can rank one entire institution versus another. You can rank a program, you can rank a faculty, you can rank social life, you can, but in it, like, how do you rank a Penn versus a Brown? Right? They're entirely different institutions with different philosophies. But because of the rankings, we have this drive for colleges have this drive to bring down acceptance rates and increase yields. Those are the two biggest numbers that go in. So to bring down acceptance rates, their marketing machines are unbelievable. The number of kids who are getting emails, apply to Harvard, apply to Harvard, apply to Harvard, are now fueling these expectations. And many schools saying, apply, no application fee, no essay, no this, no that, which is also drumming up the volume, which is putting even more downward pressure on acceptance rates. This move then to yield, which means of the students I admit, how many come, is also fueling all of these games that colleges are playing with binding early decision and restrictive, and so it's fueling even more anxiety, more disappointment. It's not healthy. And then they forget that they're dealing with, in many cases, 17-year-old kids.
It sounds so remarkably similar to what happened in 2012 when uh, when when research was being done looking at the specific like mental health diagnoses of young women, anxiety, depression, eating disorders, substance use, all these metrics, kind of bopping along, going up a little bit. 2012, there was just this rocket ship that went up. And the thing that happened in 2012 was Instagram. And it wasn't anxiety or depression that went up, it was eating disorders.
Mhm.
And it sounds so similar to what's going on in terms of like applications with these prestigious universities. Knowing that like, oh yeah, there's an unintended consequence of people feeling bad about themselves, but we have a business to run. We have an endowment to keep shoveling money into. And so like we're really sorry that like you might want to jump off of the garage building because you got denied to Princeton or Harvard, but like we've got business to do.
Sorry. Yeah.
Oh man, that sounded cynical. Oh well. Um, I get to sound cynical if I want to. Shifting gears again. You probably consume a lot of content from a lot of different sources, people, places, things. Are there any podcasts, books, articles, interviews that you've come across in the last few weeks, months, years that just really stand out for you that you love telling parents about or colleagues about?
Yeah, so I mean, quite frankly, Rob, this time of year, I'm reading college applications and essays. That is my source of content right now. So I'm very much looking forward to Thanksgiving break because I've got books on my list that I'm excited to get to. Um, I don't do a ton of podcasts. Most of the podcasts I listen to are about sort of college counseling. So the business of college counseling, Brooke Daly's is one that is probably one of the top ones. I read a lot of just business books. I like business books. So, my classmate, Charles Duhigg, The Power of Habit is a great book. I actually have his Super Communicators on my list for next week to read. Um, Arthur Brooks from Strength to Strength is fantastic. We already mentioned Dr. Leonard Sachs is one who I'm a really, really big fan of. Um, he's got great stuff. So
Okay.
I'm sort of old school. I like books.
I'm right there with you. I also all the research are from a biopsychological perspective. Books are really good for our brains. It's not a moral or ethical issue. It's just really good for us to slow down and have a little bit of a gap between between like the content and our brain processing information. So I'm right there with you. Steph, it's been such a pleasure talking with you. What is the best way for people to get in touch with you? Is it snail mail? Is it email? Is it your
No,
website?
just
Is it?
my website. Everything comes to me through my website. So it's simply www.themaulerinstitute.com. So it's THEMAULER institute.com.
Great. And as I said at the beginning of the show, I'm going to make sure that all the resources are posted in the show notes. So, Steph, thanks so much for joining me today.
My pleasure. Thank you so much.
Before you head off, I just wanted to say thanks for tuning in today. All of the resources discussed are in the show notes below. And one last thing, if you know anyone that would benefit from this episode, please forward it along to them. If you liked what you heard, please subscribe to my podcast, the YouTube channel, and the newsletter. All right, see you all next time.